The package on my doorstep wasn't from a delivery company. It was wrapped in old brown paper, tied with twine, and sitting exactly in the center of my welcome mat. Before I could touch it, my parents' SUV pulled away. My mother rolled down the window just long enough to shout one sentence. "Whatever you do, don't make a scene." Then they disappeared. My hands were shaking as I carried the box inside. The moment I peeled back the paper, I froze. My heart nearly stopped. 30 seconds later, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 because someone inside that box needed help. My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 29 years old. Until the morning that box appeared on my doorstep, I believed the hardest part of my relationship with my parents was already behind me. We'd barely spoken in almost 2 years after a bitter disagreement that slowly turned every family gathering into silence. Birthdays passed with nothing more than short text messages. Holidays came and went without invitations. I convinced myself that distance was easier than constantly reopening old wounds. So when I heard a car stop outside my house just after 9 on a quiet Saturday morning, I wasn't expecting visitors, especially not them. I looked through the front window and froze. My father climbed out of their SUV carrying a medium-sized box wrapped in old brown paper and tied tightly with rough twine. He carefully placed it in the middle of my welcome mat, almost like he was delivering something fragile. My mother stayed in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. Before I could open the front door, my father hurried back to the vehicle. As they began pulling away, my mother rolled down her window just enough to look at me. "Emily," she called, her voice shaking. "Whatever you do, don't make a scene." Then the SUV disappeared around the corner. I stood there for several seconds, completely confused. The package wasn't large, but it was heavier than it looked. There wasn't a shipping label, return address, or even my name written anywhere. Just plain brown paper wrapped with unusual care. Every instinct told me to leave it outside. Instead, curiosity won. I carried it into my kitchen, locked the front door behind me, and placed it on the table. My fingers hesitated before slowly untying the twine. Layer after layer of paper came away until a plain cardboard box sat in front of me. I lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of passports, driver's licenses, bank records, forged legal documents, and a handwritten notebook listing dozens of names beside account numbers. My stomach dropped. Someone's entire criminal operation was sitting on my kitchen table. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher stayed on the line until I heard sirens approaching my neighborhood. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 uniformed officers knocked on my front door. I stepped back, still holding my phone, and invited them inside. They immediately noticed the open box sitting on my kitchen table. One officer carefully slipped on protective gloves before looking through the contents. The other asked me to explain everything from the beginning. "I've never seen any of this before," I said honestly. "My parents left it here a few minutes ago. My mom told me not to make a scene, then they drove away." The officers exchanged a quick glance. Within another 15 minutes, 2 detectives arrived carrying evidence bags and cameras. They photographed every document before placing each item into separate evidence sleeves. One detective opened the handwritten notebook while the other examined several passports. His expression changed almost instantly. "These aren't random papers," he said quietly. "Someone has spent years organizing this." My heart pounded harder. "Am I in trouble?" I asked. He shook his head. "Right now, you're the person who reported it. That's exactly what you should have done." As they continued examining the documents, questions began flooding my mind. Why would my parents leave something this dangerous with me? Why not take it directly to the police themselves? One detective asked if my parents had seemed stressed recently. That question unlocked memories I'd ignored for months. My father had become unusually quiet. My mother had canceled family dinners without explanation. They had suddenly sold several personal belongings and withdrawn from almost everyone they knew. At the time, I assumed they were dealing with financial problems. Now it felt like something much bigger. The detectives explained that several documents appeared connected to identity fraud and forged financial agreements involving multiple victims. They couldn't discuss every detail yet, but they believed whoever created this collection had been tracking illegal transactions for a long time. A knot formed in my stomach. If my parents knew about this, I whispered, why would they wait until today? Before either detective could answer, one of their phones rang. He listened silently for several seconds, then looked directly at me. Mrs. Carter, he said calmly, someone else is on the way here, and I think they're about to answer that question. About 10 minutes later, I heard a familiar set of footsteps on the front porch. My husband, Daniel, unlocked the front door and walked inside carrying his laptop bag. He stopped the instant he saw two detectives standing in our kitchen. His eyes moved from the officers to me, then to the evidence spread across the table. Emily, what's going on? Before I could answer, one detective introduced himself and briefly explained that I had reported suspicious documents left at our home. Daniel slowly set his bag on the floor and stepped closer. Then his expression changed. He pointed toward one of the folders lying open beside the notebook. I've seen that company logo before. Every head turned toward him. The detective asked, where? Daniel swallowed. I work with several regional suppliers. About 6 months ago, one contractor submitted paperwork with this exact logo. Something fell off, but the documents looked legitimate. The contract was approved before anyone questioned it. The detective carefully slid the folder toward him. Can you identify anything else? Daniel studied several pages without touching them. After a long moment, he nodded. These signatures, they're almost identical to the ones I remember. I thought they were digital copies, but now I'm not so sure. The room suddenly felt much smaller. One detective quickly wrote down the contractor's name while the other stepped outside to make a phone call. I looked at Daniel. You never mentioned any of this. I didn't think it mattered, he admitted quietly. Nothing ever came back to us. I assumed the paperwork had been verified. A few minutes later, the detective returned with a serious expression. The contractor your husband mentioned is already part of another financial investigation. Silence filled the kitchen. The notebook, the fake identities, the contracts, they weren't isolated pieces anymore. They were all connected. The detective closed the evidence box and looked directly at us. We have enough information to search another property immediately. I glanced toward the empty driveway where my parents had stood less than an hour earlier. For the first time, I realized that whatever they had uncovered was far bigger than our family, and tonight, the entire truth was finally beginning to unravel. The detectives left our house just before sunset. Daniel and I spent the next 3 hours sitting in silence, jumping every time my phone buzzed. Finally, just after 8 that evening, one of the detectives called. We've spoken with your parents, he said. Would you be willing to meet us at the station? An hour later, Daniel and I walked into a small interview room where my mother and father were already waiting. Neither of them looked like the confident people who had driven away that morning. My father's shoulders were slumped. My mother's eyes were red from crying. I'm sorry, she whispered before I could say a word. I folded my arms. Why didn't you tell me the truth? My father took a slow breath. Several months earlier, he had discovered that a longtime business acquaintance had been using fake identities and forged documents to steal money from vulnerable people. When he confronted him, he was warned to stay quiet. Instead of going directly to the authorities, my parents secretly collected copies of every document they could find. But why bring them to me? I asked. My mother's voice trembled. Because we knew you would do the right thing. She explained they believed anyone watching them would expect them to destroy the evidence or hide it. Leaving it with me, and knowing I would immediately contact police, was the safest way to make sure the documents reached investigators. Then her strange warning finally made sense. Don't make a scene hadn't meant, ignore the box. It meant, don't confront anyone before the police arrive. The detectives later confirmed that the search had uncovered additional records matching the notebook from my kitchen. The evidence was enough to protect innocent victims and stop the fraud before more families were affected. For the first time all day, I finally understood why my parents had trusted me with the one decision that changed everything. The investigation continued for several months, and the detectives kept me informed whenever they legally could. The evidence inside that simple cardboard box helped investigators identify additional victims, trace stolen funds, and recover records that might have disappeared forever if my parents had waited even one more day. My parents fully cooperated with the investigation from that point forward. Although they regretted keeping such a dangerous secret from me, the authorities confirmed that turning over the evidence when they did had prevented even greater harm. Rebuilding our family wasn't nearly as simple. Trust doesn't return overnight. For weeks, I struggled to understand why they hadn't asked for my help sooner. My mother admitted they had been frightened, ashamed, and afraid that involving me too early would place me in danger. Hearing that didn't erase the pain, but it finally answered the questions that had haunted me. Daniel stood beside me through every difficult conversation, reminding me that honesty, even when delayed, is still better than living behind fear forever. Sometimes I think back to that quiet Saturday morning, the brown paper, the rough twine, and my mother's trembling voice telling me not to make a scene. At first, I believed they had left me with a burden. Now I realize they left me with a choice. One decision, one phone call, one ordinary-looking box. It didn't just expose the truth. It protected innocent people, reunited a broken family, and reminded me that doing the right thing is rarely easy, but it is always worth it.